Hello, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for being here with me today. It's an authentic pleasure to be invited to this first International Virtual Conference in Communication at Sungkyunkwan University in Seoul there, Madrid here, Korea, Spain. It's wonderful that we can have this sort of virtual conferences. So I really appreciate the invitation. Today we're going to be talking about a study, a piece of research that will be very soon published at an international journal. I wanted, first of all, not only introduce myself and talk about my co-authors, but also indicate a few of the things that might be worth for the audience in this conference. The data is based in the United States, so hopefully you are also interested in international data. Overall, the title of my presentation is Does Social Media Contribute to Political Attitude Change? The Role of Fake News and Political Discussion on Political Persuasion. I'm Homero Zúñiga. I'm a distinguished research professor at the University of Salamanca. I also serve as a professor at Pennsylvania State University and as a research fellow at Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. I'd like to offer also a gratitude to my two co-authors of this piece. Pablo González is one of my new and brilliant doctoral students at Salamanca in the Department of Political Science. And Manuel Guellanes is also part of the Democracy Research Unit that I direct in Salamanca, and he's a visiting professor in Carlos III. So let me get started by just laying out a few of the theoretical assumptions and issues that we need to discuss before showing the findings of this research. So political persuasion has been mostly defined as attitude change. When people change their minds politically with respect to an issue, that is understood to be political persuasion. So at any time or instances where there has been a communication intention by which a persuadee, so the person who is persuaded, tends to change their view or judgment about something, and accordingly perhaps the behavior at a later time, that is understood as political persuasion. So political persuasion obviously is not new. There are decades of research and a vast literature of political persuasion. However, political persuasion might be a little bit newer when it comes to social media. There are a limited number of studies that are dealing with how does political persuasion happens or takes place in social media in this kind of environment, and also what are the mechanisms that may help or contribute for people to change their mind, their view, and their political attitudes, right? So why is it important in today's media context to study political persuasion? Well, political persuasion to some extent serves as a key foundational trait of our democracies, particularly established democracies, both in Western societies, but also in Eastern societies, right? So why is so the case? Well, political persuasion is something that is ingrained within democracy at many different levels. So for instance, if we talk about political elites or our elected officials, persuasion happens all the time because they need to persuade their constituents, their voters, to vote for them and not for a different candidate, right? So you have political persuasion happening and taking place right there. But also the media at large practices some sort of persuasion because they want to inform the public opinion about the important public affairs issues, and they offer news, current events, and facts about politics that people may gather and have a view or make up a view, and sometimes, in some instances, change their view or their political attitudes with respect to certain issues. But it doesn't only happen with political elites and figures and media. It happens when perhaps it's most needed. It happens across the board with what we call lay citizens or public opinion leaders. We are all the time constantly trying to persuade others, and we are being persuaded at the same time. So you see that citizens are influenced by vast different mechanisms and also different layers of society and democracy. And that's why political persuasion is so interesting to be part of any study, because it might speak to the kind of democracy that we're building, right? So as you see, Public persuasion has taken place for the most part due to traditional media, but given the new media ecology, things have changed, and we want to learn more about how political persuasion is taking place in social media. For starters, social media, as opposed to face-to-face, has different networks. We know, based on prior research, that the networks that we have in social media, they tend to be larger as opposed to face-to-face networks. They also tend to be more diverse, et cetera, et cetera. And also, everything tends to happen in social media, right? People get entertained, they actually consume news, they acquire novel information, political information, and they also tend to be persuaded. So everything, or that's what we argue, and prior research suggested that that's the case, right? So although we have consistent evidence that indicates that people change their minds, and we know certain mechanisms that, as for how that happens, we really don't know much about how that takes place in social media, right? So let me just summarize the three main aspects that we consider in this study that may be influential for explaining political persuasion. The first one is social media at large. Then we have online news consumption, right? And the third one will be based on fake news exposure, which is one of the great indicators or one of the great constructs that we are seeking to set more light when it comes to political persuasion in social media. And lastly, discussion, online and social media discussion. And how all these things relate to each other is also part of what we're trying to achieve with this study, to learn how things work in terms of predicting how people may change their minds. So why social media and consuming news in social media may facilitate the process? Well, the mechanism might be very similar to what happens face-to-face. So, but perhaps in social media, it gets expanded, reinvigorated, or even fostered, right? Why so? Well, for the most part, when people get presented and exposed to novel information, new information, facts that they didn't know, that tends to change their minds. Maybe I didn't know about this, and I didn't know about this candidate, and all these things that I'm learning now, so maybe I'm going to change my vote. Or I'm learning more about a particular issue that is interesting to me, and there were things that I didn't know about. Now I have more information, new information, that may elicit a political attitude change. Well, in social media also we know that networks tend to be more heterogeneous, and if they're heterogeneous, they might be offering more information that might be diverse and different to what I was expecting or what I'm used to consuming face-to-face or offline. So now social media may provide me with new means of acquiring novel information, and that is important. Also, the information, since its networks are going to be more diverse, I'm going to be exposed to information that might be counter-attitudinal to my political views. And that is key, because one of the main reasons for me to change my mind is, if anything, to be exposed to other people's views, right? Whether through news or through discussion, as we will see later. So we know for a fact that when people are exposed to different new information, they have higher chances of being persuaded. We also know, based on prior research, that in social media, this tends to happen. People consume news in social media, they're presented with novel information, and then share their minds, right? So in this study, we want to replicate those findings to some extent when it comes to social media, and include a better, more coherent model with all the things that may take place at social media. One of those things is exposure to fake news. So it might be the case that people, when they are navigating social media, they do not only get exposed to factual information. They may indeed also get exposed to fabricated news that are non-factual based, but also they might influence the way they have an understanding over an issue, because fake news, thanks to the capabilities and the structure of social media and the networks, they can be easily disseminated, since fake news tend to be also more shocking. Research indicates that they will also be dispersed and distributed more rapidly and become viral. And this can happen, we argue in the paper theoretically, under two different views or two different manners, two different ways. One is a conscious one, right? When fake news is assumed to be authentic, I'm just exposed to fake news, but I take them as authentic. So my attitude is going to change. No matter the topic, whatever it is, I'm just consuming news that I take for granted, and I go, whoa, this has happened, I didn't know about it, and that's going to influence me. But also unconsciously, they might affect or exert a negative influence on people's emotions, regardless of whether it's a conscious one. The unconscious one may also have an effect, right? So it might affect my levels of political attitudes when it comes to efficacy, when it comes to polarization, things that maybe I was not thinking so consciously, but they're also nonetheless affecting me, right? So that's what we know about fake news. Why then we can put those novel pieces of information that we acquire either through social media consumption of news or fake news may affect political persuasion. We argue that it will not only be a direct effect, but also through the means of discussing politics in social media. And we know that when people consume news, they end up discussing politics. So they consume news, they're exposed to information, and then discuss with others issues pertaining to the information that they consume. And in social media, once again, they might have discussions with people who might think differently to them, and they may express different views, right? So beyond the fact-check news, right, people discuss information that may not be factual as well, and they're discussing that. So we also expect that there will be an influence through fake news and discussion of fake news in affecting people's political attitude change. So once the discussions have happened and they occur, and people discussing politics, one of the things that tends to happen, according to research, is that they will follow up with more information. So it's a cycle. People discuss information, they acquire information, they discuss more information, and they double check that information or seek further information. They want to double check things, they want to verify facts, or they want to further contextualize that information that they were exposed to, right? And in addition to that, exposure to discussion disagreement, we also know that for the most part, will lead people to reconsider their thoughts. And this is an important issue because when they are exposed to news, they tend to do this, but particularly when they're exposed to discussion, they might rethink their position on an issue. And when they're discussing with people that may have diverse views, this may tend to happen quite more often. So we are confident that the discussions that take place in social media should have an influence on political attitude change on individuals or social media users. Here we have our hypothesis. Hypothesis one, the online news consumption will directly predict political attitude change. Likewise, social media news exposure should lead to political persuasion. And the third one, which is a novel theoretical addition to this paper, is that when people are exposed to fake news, that will also lead them to be politically persuaded. Finally, beyond the testing of these direct effects, we wanted to learn more about how these will work as an instructor. Our idea is that people first will get exposed to news either online or in social media, and then when they do that, they will have a higher chance of getting exposed to fake news. And we also thought that when people are exposed to both news and fake news, they will tend to discuss more, which in turn will lead them to change their minds. So that's the theoretical assumption of our structure. We wanted to also test that to see whether it worked or not. Here I have a more dense slide about the data collection and the measurements. I will not stop dramatically on this. Maybe you can pause the video if you want to learn about something, and always feel free to send me an email if you want to learn about a particular construct. Our constructs are very straightforward. They have either been already validated and tested in prior literature, or we drew on prior literature and build on those to generate a more meaningful and valid measurement of what we were trying to pursue. In this case, fake news, that's the way we did it. Political persuasion is 3 items, as I say, previously validated. Social media news, it was composed of 13 items with a very solid Convergence alpha 0.91, and the same happened with online news, only 3 items, and fake news. For fake news, we consider 3 items building on the work of Alcott and Getsko and also Laser and colleagues, trying to capture this idea that people were exposed to fabricated information or stories that deliberately contain misleading elements and information to make you believe that it was correct. It's 3 items. Combat alpha is quite solid, 0.92. One caveat, and we can discuss this in the discussion section, or also perhaps in your questions if you have any via email, is that our measurement of exposure is self-assessment of exposure. To some extent, this limits the idea of registering whether or not unobtrusively people are exposed to fake news, but also their sense or their assessment of whether or not they are exposed to fake news. So there is a component of recognition that what I'm being exposed to is fake news. So that has certain implications both for the analysis and the limitations of the study. And finally, we had 6 items tapping whether people discuss politics online and on social media, discussion with people who were closest to oneself in their echo networks, right? So whether they were strong ties or weak ties, and the combat alpha was also pretty solid. So first, as for the results, I laid out here a table of correlations so people can see how things relate to each other. And one of the things that was interesting to me as a bivariate relationship, just to learn some behaviors, how they go together, is to see that not only discussions, social media, and so on and so forth, in a bivariate testing related to fake news, but also consuming information in traditional media to some extent is positively related to fake news. But let's test this in a more stringent basis. This autoregressive OLS regressions have 3 different models in which you see here that we have political persuasion as our dependent variable for all the 3 models. And we test, that's why this the first block is the autoregressive terms. So in all 3 models, we predicted levels of individuals' political persuasion in time by controlling how much they were persuaded in prior time. So we're controlling for prior levels of political persuasion in an autoregressive term. And our interest here was to see directly whether or not, without competing evidence, beyond the demographics and media antecedents and orientations that we know were important in predicting political persuasion, such as regular social media use, TV news, newspaper, or political interest, et cetera, we wanted to test whether discussion, which is positively related to political persuasion in all 3 models, but also social media news, online news, and fake news predicted persuasion. And you see that all 3, social media news, online news, and ultimately fake news exposure, they all predicted social media political persuasion, so a political attitude change. Now, these were direct effects in an autoregressive, so quite stringent models, but we didn't put them to compete to each other in the structure. That's what we did next, and we tested it. And when we do so, what we learn is that through the structural equation modeling is that, as you can see here, the strongest predictor of persuasion is discussion. Discussion is what really leads people to change their minds politically. When people discuss politics in social media and online, that leads them to be persuaded. Social media and online news, as expected, will predict fake news exposure, and all 3 of them, social media, online, and fake news exposure, will be directly related to discussion. And in turn, discussion will predict persuasion. But please note, bear in mind that there's no direct effect of social media news consumption, online news consumption, or fake news itself to political persuasion. It's all of them through the means of discussion. And discussion is what importantly predicts persuasion directly. So the indirect mechanisms indicate that the strongest path for this to work out is when social media leads people to discuss, social media news consumption leads people to discuss, and that in turn will predict persuasion. And similarly, social media through the means of fake news and discussion will also predict political attitude change. And for online news, it also works through the means of discussion. So online news consumption, discussion, and persuasion tends to happen, but there's no indirect effect going from online news and fake news. This is an interesting, important step, which indicates that when people are consuming online news, there might be something in there that, although it exposes them to fake news, maybe it's more factual based, the information they consume online, and they're exposed to fake news, they're more likely to discern that these are fake news and they don't get persuaded. That's an important pattern there. So just to wrap up, because the talk should be about 20 minutes, and I'm right there, I think, right now. So let me stress and highlight a few of the points that I think are fundamental to understanding the process of consuming information in social media and online, and discussing and being exposed to fake news when it comes to political persuasion in social media. The first thing is that facts matters. The facts really matter. When people consume information that is factual through professional media outlets, then they have a better understanding of the issues based on facts. And it's a key driver, that novel factual information is a key driver as individuals incorporate those issues cognitively and end up changing their minds, right, politically. So when it's factual, it really matters. But so does social media. Social media also matters because when they consume news in social media, particularly through fake news and through discussion, people tend to change their mind. Why so? Well, we argue theoretically that one of the things that happens is that information in social media hinges in this idea of trust. We already discussed that the networks are going to be more diverse, more heterogeneous, and larger, but your connections there are hinged on trust. You trust these people to some extent, so when they push information your way, and when you see it something that doesn't come from alone, from maybe a news outlet or whatever it comes, it also comes endorsed or endured or curated by someone that you trust. And those filtration tactics matter, because ultimately they will matter how individuals are processing cognitively that information, to the extent that it affects them the way they change their mind about political issues. And along these lines, trust overall seems to also matter. I think one of the things that we learned from this study is that information, when it comes from coworkers, when it comes from friends and from other agents, maybe it comes from political leaders that you trust and follow, that also matters to explain the overall influence of this. So what about fake news? Well, fake news, there's, empirical evidence, at least as for now, with this one-time study, and we need more accumulated evidence on this, but now we know that when people are exposed to fake news, if not directly, although in the first test it works directly with many controls, but when it's competing with other media behaviors in social media, we know that it won't have a direct effect, but rather an effect through discussion. But the idea is that beyond the testing, how does this work theoretically? That's one of the things that is interesting to me, right? So one take is, well, people are exposed to non-factual information, and they actually believe it. I take this piece as factual, even though it's not, but I take it as factual, and then I trust what they're telling me, I draw in that information, and it changes my mind. Donald Trump has saved Latin America, and Donald Trump is the best friend of Korea now. It's fake, but I trust it, so that happened, it changed my mind. And then I say, oh, so wow, this is happening with the world. It changes my political attitudes with respect to Korea and Latin America, perhaps, right? But it also may be that the information that I'm exposed to is fake, non-factual, and people recognize that it's non-factual, which is, given the measurement that we have, it's most likely what is happening here, right? People are exposed to fake news, and they also know they might fake news. Why would that have an effect? Well, it does have an effect, and we argue because of two things. One is because even though people may actually understand that they're being exposed to factual news, there's research that indicates that over time, people do not tend to remember the sources of information. So if in time, I'm not going to recall whether the information came from the New York Times or from a friend, or I read it somewhere, I remember at least 50% of the people don't breathe air because they're aliens. But I can't remember where I read that. I know it's 50% of the people, right? So the idea here is that over time, I don't recall where the information comes from based on Jankowski's work. So since I don't know the provenance of information, I take it as true over time, even though back in the day I recognized it was fake, but ultimately the effect on my mind ends up being the same as if it was non-fake news or factual news. The other part of it is that we don't know the certainty of a change of this influence, right? Because we're thinking all the time, oh yeah, information change, attitude change. So you think that this information changed your mind towards the other side of your thought, right? It doesn't align with your prior thinking. You change your mind the other way. But it might be that what is happening is that based on that fake news information, it aligns with my views. I might even recognize or not, but I might even recognize those news is fake, but it doesn't matter because it aligns with my view, and to some extent, it exerts an influence cognitively on my thinking, and I don't change my mind, but I become more polarized, I become more extreme, I become persuasively polarized, if you may, and that's also important, right? So I would like to pay attention to that, and future research needs to delve into these issues much further, obviously, perhaps in an experimental setting, so we can isolate this important caveat of this research when it comes to fake news exposure measurement. All right, so I'm going to stop right there. I think I got just a couple minutes over the limit here. So if you have any questions, feel free to follow me in Twitter and connect through Twitter, or just send me an email. In any case, thank you very much for your attention. It's been, again, a pleasure to be in this first international virtual conference, and I look forward to hear from you. So thank you. I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.